Round.
Okay, it is after 5 and we have a slim crew here tonight. Councilor Wygard, Councilor Gardner, Councilor Kenny and myself. But we are going to get started on time and see if we get joined by others. I'm only aware that Councilor Robertson was unable to make it tonight. And our town manager is joining us by virtual Zoom. But we have the very capable Mitch Stone and Kyle Drexler here to help us through. You hear us okay, Sophie? Good. We'll move on to Comprehensive Plan Implementation Committee and pass the baton to Ms. Gardner.
Thank you very much. All right, so for our first item, we will be discussing low impact development model ordinance guidelines in preparation for submittal to the Maine Department of Environmental Protection for approval prior to local land use ordinance revision. That is a great title. Kyle?
So, I think everyone here has been through the stormwater training and, through that, we learned about the general permit that the town has as an MS4 community, with DEP. And so there was a recent, new permit issued this past winter. And one of the updates to the permit that wasn't a requirement in the past is to include this low impact development ordinance, which low impact development, just briefly, is just various ways of doing just what it's now. It's making any sort of project or development less impactful on the environment and stormwater, whether it's through utilizing a smaller parking area or utilizing a green roof or rain barrels or whatever it is. The sort of troublesome kind of part of this whole thing is that generally when we create an ordinance, we go through the committee process where we talk about ideas and we come up with a draft, and it goes through the public process at that point, and we take the feedback and goes officially through public hearings, and that's sort of the logical progression. With this, the process that DEP outlined for MS4 communities is that we are required to submit a model ordinance to DEP by September 1st. You don't have to actually adopt that ordinance or some version of the ordinance for about 1.5 years from then, but the version that you eventually adopt has to be at least as strict as the model that you submit to DEP. So if you say, all of these applicable projects are required to have 30% open space in your model ordinance, you can't turn around and write in, that they only need 20% open space in the adoption version. I do think this is sort of, new territory a little bit. So it does sound like there's probably some room for conversation, with DEP, negotiating over things, when we submit the model ordinance, working on things, in those first few months while they're giving us feedback after we submit something. But it's a little unclear. So really the way it was supposed to go is there was a few groups that I referenced in the memo who are kind of tasked with putting together a model ordinance that all MS4 communities could use. So they didn't have to all start this process from scratch. So that was, I think, attached in your materials ahead of time. So I won't go through that whole thing. Myself and some other staff members attended some of those meetings as they were working on putting together that model ordinance. I think it was a pretty hard thing to do because the way the permit is worded is that, LID is this non-rigid kind of set of standards. It could be any number of things, and you could have some things apply to one project and different things apply to another project. But then the permit asks us to take these LID measures or goals that the permit outlines, like minimizing impervious area, minimizing soil compaction, all those sorts of things. And it asks MS4 communities to create specific performance standards that speak to those measures. So that's what these groups were trying to do in the model ordinance that was attached. They were trying to create specific performance standards that communities could use to accomplish these LID measures that DEP outlined. And the original list model ordinance that sort of was come up with, that a lot of those optional standards that they're showing optional now, they weren't optional originally. And I think a lot of MS4 communities had some pretty big concerns because it was getting into the idea of creating specific land use standards, like talking about length of dead end streets and amount of open space. And I mean, these are things that would impact people's ordinances a lot, and you'd be potentially altering your whole ordinance without that going through a public process at all. Because you're just submitting it in your model to DEP, and then you'd be required to implement it at some point in some capacity.
So just to clarify.
Yep.
The way that this whole thing is constructed, it benefits communities to adopt the bare minimums.
Yes.
And then add things on.
Yep.
Okay,
So that's sort of what we've been trying to think about, is what exactly is the bare minimum? Because I mean, it's hard to say without submitting something to DEP and getting feedback on it. And one of the concerns is that, okay, so this model ordinance has been created. If the majority of communities just kind of blindly submit this model ordinance to DEP, and then a few other communities say, well, that doesn't really work for us, we want to create our own. And, you know, we think that model goes above and beyond what the permit originally asked for. I mean, but what if DEP says, well, everyone else is doing this, so, you know, we think you should do something at least as, you know, strict as that as well. So, I mean, those are sort of all unanswerable questions that some communities had going through it. At the end of the day, I think where the model that they got to kind of finished up with a lot of those, you know, questionable standards being made optional. I think the structure and the framework of what they laid out is good, and there's a lot that we could use there. I think we you know, probably talk with some of our, you know, with Megan and, you know, in her position, and Rob and Bell and town engineer, and kind of try to fill in some of those numbers, you know, and standards in a way of, okay, does this open up any concerns for us? You know, are we accomplishing their goals while not necessarily going above and beyond what they're asking for? Because we can always go back later and add in any number of LID standards. So that'll be the process that we're looking to do in the next month, and then submit some form of model ordinance, but it's not really an ordinance yet, to DEP for feedback.
this might be a Sophie question, but I'm assuming there's a plan for us to take a look at that draft before September 1st, or no? Or yes?
We really don't have a lot of time, which is why I think Kyle is asking for a box, because what we're giving to DEP is a box that you can then craft an ordinance within.
Okay, because I will say that I feel confident in Kyle and the rest of staff that are working on this, and I don't have any concerns in that department. But what I do have a lot of concerns with is that the typical process would be that we see a draft of something based on conversation. We have significant input into it. We present it to the public. There are many steps before we're locked in. In this, it's like we're blindly sort of handing a box to staff, and then we're married to that box as of September 1st. And that is not a criticism of staff. I'm confident in staff that they'll do a great job. That is a criticism of the state.
So, while Kyle has been working on his effort to try to create the box, I have had conversation with other representatives from other communities with a request that we ask DEP to flip this to give us longer to get the box done and shorter to get the ordinance in place. I don't know that that's going to go anywhere, but I have talked with the engineer that represents many communities in this effort.
So,
And-
Sophie, my understanding with that is, you know, we met about this the other day and there was some feedback and having conversations with DEP and said that wouldn't happen because they would have to reopen the permit to public comment, I think. So it's unlikely that the permit itself would be changed from the process. And I think it was a result of that conversation that it came out of, you know, with DEP's willingness to work with people through that initial few month period of, okay, you submitted a model. Basically, what it sounded like is the verbal information that they provided in some conversations with people sounded more lenient than what the permit actually said, so that's not super comforting,
No.
but I don't really know where else to. I don't think there's much room for the permit to be changed at this point.
But there would be room for, before our model becomes a final model that impacts our ordinances, there will be quite a bit of lead time and opportunity for the kind of process that we usually see. Is that true?
Right, but we can't peel back anything that goes
Yeah.
into the model as of September 1st.
Right,
We
right.
could
So we
just
would
add
still,
to.
right,
Yeah.
we'd still go
Yeah.
through all of that normal, okay, now we've submitted the model, DEP said, okay, it's okay. We still go through the committee process of drafting it, planning board public hearing, council public hearing and all of that. And I don't know, I mean, maybe they're not tied to maybe, you can submit something afterwards that says, okay, this is different than what the model said, but we believe it's of equal value in terms of low impact development, so we'd rather change to this. And maybe there's room for something like that. I'm hoping so.
I would imagine there would be, that if there's a compelling rationale for the ways in which our model evolves over time, that the
So,
DEP would
I'm,
have
I'm
some.
sorry to interrupt, but I'm having a super hard time hearing you, Sonia.
Oh, sorry. I was
Can you-
just saying
Thank
that
you.
to speculate, I would imagine that DEP would have some amount of flexibility built in if we had a really good rationale for why our model changed from the initial proposal to a subsequent proposal. I would envision the state wanting to work with us on that.
And I love the optimism. I maybe don't share it.
It's fine.
And I think this is horrible government. This is not obviously a reflection on us, but I just think this is they're throwing this fire drill at us, and I think that's really frightening to suggest even if we do a bare minimum box, which we would attempt to do, which we don't really know what they're gonna approve, but still it's just a backwards process, clearly from everything you guys described here. I'm wondering, and I understand you're saying that you don't think there's room for them to change. I wonder, we use these proclamations for different things, and there's 30 communities that are being held to fire here out of 480 in the state. I wonder, could 30 of us get together with with an agreed upon proclamation that we all councils approved to say, time out, this isn't how we do this, and so why are we?
So I appreciate your optimism, Leo.
Well.
So the issue with the MS4 permit is there are so many layers to this onion where ultimately the state had to have it approved. This has taken, remember, we were on year 9 of a 5-year permit because people couldn't all agree. And so I had hoped that the pressure would work if Kyle is saying that this group can't get these folks can't get traction, then I really would. I really don't think that we're gonna get much. I think the move here is to try to be as open and least restrictive as we can be, to then allow council to come tighten it up if they so choose. I think Kyle's really working on that.
So I think we've established that we have concerns and we've expressed our grievances, and we also probably can't do very much more than is already being done about that part. So let's talk about the box.
Yeah, so I think a lot of the standards outlined in the model ordinance are things that our ordinance kind of currently speaks to in some capacity, you know, like when the first one they outlined, prioritizing protection of sensitive areas. I mean, that's really something people are doing largely anyway. You know, depicting the limits of disturbance on the project plans. For projects of this size, that's happening anyway. You know, if you start to remove the optional standards in there, that dead end streets no longer than 1,000 feet, you know, making your off-street parking minimums now maximums, like those would be the real changes in the types of standards of what our ordinance would offer. You know, runoff from roof, sidewalks, you know, those types of impervious surface going into stormwater treatment buffers. A lot of it, the standards that are in the ordinance, the model as it's currently laid out, are directly tied to stormwater. It doesn't really affect the development itself as far as the, you know, the actual the building or the road or things like that. You know, for instance, I mean, our off-street parking section of our ordinance already talks about breaking up large parking areas into smaller impervious areas. It's things like that that this ordinance is really aiming to do. Like for our cluster development, we already have an open space requirement. You know, that's one of the optional standards in here that would apply to, you know, all projects over this acre threshold.
But wasn't there wording in here about projects that are less than an acre and?
Yep, so that would not, I mean, that's something that I think we would pull back on for sure. So if you go to the applicability section, find it. So anything in blue would be optional, and I would say anything optional we would want to leave out from the beginning. Not that we couldn't add it, or not that we couldn't add it. It's not that they're bad ideas or they're, you know, they serve the purpose that they serve, but I think each community would want to look at those things individually and might have different ways of getting there.
Well, I was thinking that, like, what are the things that I would not want to be part of this box? And they would be the things that we would be likely to hear most feedback from the public during public comment on, and that's typically, you know, acres, lot sizes, size of this, size of that, impact on people's day-to-day lives. I mean, and those seem to mostly be the optional items.
Right. So a lot of that was like, for instance, you know, what this applies to, you know, the disturbed area of 1 or more acres. I mean, that's what would be required for new projects and redevelopment projects. Which is
Every single family home, basically, right, that would be built.
no, a single family home wouldn't have a disturbed area of more than an acre. Maybe, you know, I mean, first you need, you would need a lot substantially more than an acre, I think, to get. However, you know, the optional standard where it talks about, you know, 5,000 square feet or more of new impervious area, you know, if you included that in there, maybe a single family home, large single family home, but still you might trigger that, you know, if they have a few thousand square foot home and then, you know, parking area, some pathways, who knows, you could get there maybe.
Like the only size dimension thing that I found that wasn't in the optional was the vehicle parking stall dimension standard, but do we already have something like that?
So vehicle parking stall dimension maximum of 9 by 18. So right now we require 9 by 18 spaces. It's not a maximum. But I think every single site plan that I've seen since I've been here has utilized 9 by 18 parking spaces. So I think that's something like that would probably make sense to go in. You know, I don't think I've ever seen someone propose a 10 by 20 parking space. It seems unnecessary. Usually people want to go smaller. If anything, they want compact spaces to be able to fit more into a smaller area. And, you know, it's written right in there that you can have exceptions. I think we would be able to write in some sort of, I think with a lot of this, even the required pieces, we might want to try in the model to write in some sort of exception or something. When they were creating this, they wanted to stay away from those, oh, you know, just do this to the maximum extent practical, because then that opens the door for any developer to just come to the planning board and ask for a waiver. And now you're asking the planning board to set a precedent for all of these things. And, you know, where's the justification for them to say, you know, well, it's required for you, but not for this other person. So I think they wanted to stay away from that sort of language for the most part. But I think, you know, we could certainly write some exceptions in there where it was valid. And I'm not sure that, you know, one of the things that we talked about when some of these optional standards were, you know, just part of the model originally, you know, one of the things we had considered was, instead of saying all of these standards are required for every project, you know, can we develop some sort of like point scale system where every project needs to, you know, add up to 5 LID points, and you can choose from this list of whatever 10, 15 performance standards, so that, you know, each project they could pick what's most applicable to them. With a lot of those optional ones being taken out, I'm not sure if that's still needed. But I think if DEP was looking for more of those sort of optional things to go in there, that's kind of a framework that we could utilize. So it might be worthwhile to propose that framework through the model to see if it would, you know, kind of get the okay from DEP, which would just allow a little more flexibility to developers.
I like the sound of that, but then I get very nervous about being married to it. What if we don't like it as much when we try to put it in practice? But I do like that point system. I think it's for the same reason that, although I'm not in favor of putting any of the optional items in for obvious reasons, but you know, I also was interested in the exception to the 40% open space, 25% open space as being a fee in lieu, because it's not necessarily a bad thing to have the ability to put your open space where it makes sense for your own town. I mean, there are things like, I like the idea of ways we can build in flexibility, but of course, to be very careful about what we show them on September 1st.
Yeah, so I mean, part of the concern with some of this was similar to the housing bill when we looked at that. It's only taking into consideration this one issue. It's taking into consideration low impact development, which is the impact of development on the environment. The requiring open space on every single lot isn't always a good thing. You know, you want a lot of times denser areas more closely developed to protect larger areas of open space in other places. So requiring that 20% open space on individual lots will in turn spread things out and lead to more sprawl and all sorts of bad things. So that's why it was a lot of people were weary of just including all of that, and just every community follows that, because every community is gonna have different goals in their comp plan and things like that for those sorts of things. So it was nice that those became optional. Yeah, so I think that's pretty much summarizes what our thoughts were so far. And yeah, so I mean, there's no adoption here or anything, but it's more getting a general okay.
So Kyle, just one question that I have, if we follow the logic of, doing kind of a bare minimum first draft, and they don't like it, and then they say, resubmit.
I think so. I'm not really sure. The permit says, you submit the model by September 1st. And that by November, I think November 1st, maybe, you know, in that time frame, DEP opens it up for public comment. And that they either approve the model or they provide the necessary feedback that would allow it to be approved by November sometime. But I'm not sure the exact process there of the level of interaction between individual communities and DEP.
Very interesting.
Clarification. So we just mentioned we were in year 9 of a 5-year contract or something for our permit for MS4. So have we submitted our application for permit for MS4?
Yes.
So-
And-
Do you want me to
and-
take that, Kyle, since I
Yeah.
spoke to it? So, it's not an application that we submit. The state and the federal government go back and forth to get a permit approved. We then fall under that permit. It took them 4 extra years to get the permit approved, and now what you're seeing is the wrangling for us to start doing the compliance measures within each year of the permit.
Oh, so it's not like every 5 years we submit something, it's we're in this. And and stuff changes every 5 years or whatever, and we adapt to it. That's what this is. I didn't understand. that.
So yes, except I would add that Kyle and Bell are really active with the regional stormwater group that has input into the process. But
And
ultimately, it's
So we do have to submit what's called a notice of intent to comply, which means that we're legally told that we must be in this program, and we say, okay, we are going to do that. And we submitted what's called a stormwater management plan with our notice of intent to comply, and that lays out how we intend to comply with the terms of the permit. There's some flexibility within that stormwater management plan. For example, we were able to choose a target audience, but the components of the plan are fixed, like the LID ordinance we must do, and public engagement we must do. How we do that is where we have some discretion.
And
Thank
this
you.
is something that we talked with council committee about before I signed the notice of intent to comply. But, ultimately, I don't have much choice but to sign that.
Yeah, that sounds like that, which is, what's the point of it? I mean, can you opt out? No.
No.
What's the? I guess it's just an acknowledgement that we're sorry, basically, know what they're doing.
Which, to be clear, I don't want anybody to watch this discussion and have the takeaway that MS for permits are bad, or that we are not interested in low impact development. It's just the process by which this unfolding is not comfortable in terms of getting input from our residents, as usual. Do other folks have any comments to make about the box that we're sending staff off with.
I might mention, Kyle, in your discussion that, the groups that participated in the development of this, the Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission, Cumberland County Soil and Water Conservation District. And they wrote standards on things like snow removal that may apply much better in southern Maine than in central and northern Maine. And those are not some of the optional items. So I wonder, what happens if we get a humongous snowstorm, we have snow removal area designated as outside of stormwater zone that is suddenly not sufficient. It doesn't have sufficient capacity to handle our snowstorm. I don't know how we get around that, but it might be worth mentioning that a plan developed by Southern Maine planners may not be applicable in other parts of the state.
Yeah, so I think a lot of I think they borrowed and used as reference. Some other neighboring states, the kind of language around this that those places have created. I think that's sort of what I was hoping to do with some other staff over the next month is draw up this model, put in the standards, and then, that are outlined here, but then kind of tweak them a little bit if, something like that. If, okay, maybe we want to change how snow storage is depicted. So I don't think there would be a concern with that one. Most site plans, most people are already depicting snow storage areas. And what it's really talking about there is that you're not putting it in your stormwater treatment measure. So if you have some stormwater management BMP, like under, drain or something like that, you're not just putting the snow like right on it, or it's not going in the shoreland zone. But I mean, also something like that, I mean, what if the whole lot is in the shoreland zone? So I think that's where we can take those standards, but maybe tweak the language a little bit to make it a little more comfortable. And that's what I want to work with Megan and Rob and Bill and Andy.
My only other question that I had when I was looking at it, and I'm scanning again our land use ordinance, but when it came to the definitions section on this model ordinance, there was just sort of a blank spot for us to name the districts that would be, or the zones that would be considered rural, the ones that would be considered suburban, and then the words rural and suburban factor really heavily into some of these determinations. So I was kind of curious how you might handle that.
So I think we can take out the whole rural, suburban, and urban thing altogether.
Okay.
I think it was more necessary when they were looking at the optional standards. Most of the required standards are applicable to all three. And it was this really weird kind of arbitrary thing where they were asking communities to set their own rural, suburban, and urban areas. But it made it seem like, for us, our urbanized area is really east of the interstate. So does that mean for us, we would set our whole urbanized area to, be urban, and we wouldn't have any rural and suburban areas on ours? So yeah, that's something I kind of I was hoping to get away from. I think most of the required performance standards that they have on here were for all three. So I think we would just be able to leave out that language altogether. I think there's one that does specify rural and suburban, preserving the natural pre-development drainage ways. If we wanted a certain standard, out of a certain area, I think we could just name the district or something. I don't think we have to use that language in those definitions.
Anyone else have any other questions or comments before we move on? Okay. Let's see, item B is a review of the proposed homestay ordinance revision post council public hearing. So we already have the public hearing on this ordinance revision. And so what I was thinking for this item is that I would ask Kyle to provide a very brief overview just for any public that might be tuning in and wondering what the heck are they talking about. Very briefly, sort of the brief 5-year history of this item. But you know, what we've been doing, why we've been doing it, where we ended up in the process. Before we have any council discussion.
Sure, so. I think this whole idea started in the comp plan. It had a recommendation to amend the ordinance to include homestays, bed and breakfast, and hotels, motels as kind of this all types of lodging. And what it was referring to, or what came out of that initially, was an amendment to the ordinance where this idea of homestays was created. That was at a time when online short-term rental services weren't what they are now. It was really owner-occupied situations where, you know, people were renting out a bedroom or something like that. So there was this umbrella term created in the land use ordinance in the zoning table called travelers accommodations. And under travelers accommodations, you have homestays, bed and breakfasts, and then hotels, motels. So, you know, they're identified as a commercial use, all falling under this. Homestays sort of fit in this hybrid role in the ordinance of being under travelers accommodations as a type of lodging for transient guests. And then also under home occupations, which is, you know, where home businesses, home offices, things like that lie, some sort of activity taking place in what's typically a residential structure. So after I think a couple of years probably, you know, the short-term rental services started being used a little differently. People started using homestays or short-term rentals, you know, in a different way by renting out just to non-owner occupied units, or they might have a two-family dwelling where they live in one unit and rent out a second unit, or a multifamily where they live in one and rent out, you know, one of the other units. But our ordinance didn't capture that. Our ordinance, it specifically said, and these were, you know, this was some of the questions we had from council and leading up to this discussion is, you know, around what the rental registration covers. You know, the rental registration talks about long-term rentals, and it says it doesn't apply to transient occupancy in a hotel, motel, inn, bed and breakfast, or similar lodging facility. So with homestays falling under that travelers accommodations definition, you know, it fits into that transient occupancy. You know, that verbiage is right in the definition for travelers accommodations. So if a short-term rental didn't fit within the rental registration and these non-owner occupied short-term rentals weren't allowed under our current homestay definition, if we wanted to allow them, we needed to kind of expand that homestay definition to allow different types of short-term rentals, you know, owner occupied and non-owner occupied. And that's what we aim to do with the ordinance amendment by creating 2 tiers of homestay: your homestay 1, which is your owner occupied situations, and homestay 2, which is your non-owner occupied situations. You know, they would be treated similarly to how, you know, a home office is allowed in all districts and is a permit in all districts, and a home business, when you're actually bringing people to the, you know, the neighborhood, to the dwelling, you know, can sometimes require a minor application to the planning board to just, you know, take those things into consideration. So we looked at doing that the same for the homestay, where, you know, the owner occupied situations would be allowed in all districts and require a permit similar to other home occupations. And then homestay 2s, the non-owner occupied types, In any commercial district would just be a permit. In the residential districts, where having that transient kind of turnover, potentially, pretty frequently, kind of creates a different atmosphere than what a residential neighborhood might be used to. They would be required to go to the planning board for that abbreviated site plan review where, you're looking at, okay, how much parking are you providing? Is there any screening, those sorts of things. If you're building a new structure, is it, residential appearance? Are you putting a sign up? If so, it has to follow the normal home occupation signs, all of that. And then we created just a couple standards specific to homestays, like, you can't have a homestay in a mobile vehicle or a tent or something like that, something that we normally wouldn't consider a dwelling unit in the first place. But as it's kind of a common practice in some places for people to rent out those sorts of things on sites like Airbnb, wanted to include that. But beyond that, it really wasn't adding in any more specific standards to homestays than what currently exists. The main point was to expand the definition to allow these non-owner occupied homestays to legally exist in the community. So we have a few of them. I checked recently just to see if that number from when we first started looking at this conversation to now, the number of Airbnbs in the town had grown substantially. I don't think it has. I think it's pretty similar to what it's been the last 2 years, probably in the, if you pick any kind of sample date range, you're probably going to get somewhere between 5 and 10 in the community. So I don't think we're at the point now, just like we were a few years ago where, short-term rentals are taking away from our existing housing stock and, creating this huge demand like they are in some other communities on the coast and in bigger cities, but I think that's the kind of general overview. I don't know if I missed anything, Sophie. Happy to answer any questions.
So, just again, to kind of frame this out for the public that might be watching at home, over the last 5 years, council has worked on this with staff in a series of public meetings. We finally came to agreement on a draft of this ordinance revision. It went out for a public hearing. And then at the point for adopting it, we had then 3 new council members who expressed an interest in hitting pause so that they could take a look at this before they voted. And that is the purpose here today, is for the group of us to determine whether the majority of council is interested in reopening this ordinance and working on it again, or whether the majority of council is interested in moving it back on the agenda for a formal adoption vote. And so I thought that it might be most useful, since those of us who worked with this for a long time have expressed various times that we're pretty comfortable. We're comfortable with the ordinance as written, that the councilors who had questions take this time now to ask those questions.
I would like to appreciate that. So yeah, I was the one that asked to postpone this. And I had met with Kyle after, and it's been mentioned a couple times that under the current rental registration program, short-term rentals are not an approved use. And I just don't agree with that on its face. I met to understand with Kyle why, and it's directly from the applicability section, I think is what Kyle directed me to, which I had shared with other counselors before this meeting, that I thought we were going to talk about this because I had trouble reading. But in that applicability section, it talks about transient occupancy in connection with specific types of facilities like hotels, motels, inns, bed and breakfast facilities, which Kyle just mentioned. And so it's not just, you can't just separate transient occupancy. it's related to those types of facilities. Every person doing short-term that I know, and for the record, I have direct experience with this. I've been in the rental registration program since its inception. And in fact, the property I live in now was originally a short-term rental property. I registered it through the registration program, and there was nothing illegal about it. There was nothing in there that asks for or states length of lease. There's no requirement within that registration application that specifies what the length of the lease is, and that's really what we're talking about here. We're talking about length of lease. And there's, again, I did it all and it doesn't matter, I can't get in trouble for it, but it was all legal at the time, and I followed the instructions. So I just don't, I think you can't separate transient occupancy from types of facilities. It clearly addresses types of facilities in that applicability section. And it also just, it really, that, I don't know the intent of that, but it really feels like that is there. And I think there's another phrase at the beginning of it that says, or unless you're trying to, everything needs to be registered except for these, or unless you're trying to do something to get around registration is what it sounds like. So it really is, I think, pushing everybody towards the registration program, and the fact that it does tie in facility is relevant because it's written right there. And when I did obviously read this language. So beyond that, again, I just don't think I don't think we should be doing it. I think it's not required, and in fact, we're covered for short term. But when I do read this, reviewing the language, I think this thing becomes complicated very quickly, because we are kind of creating our own terms and we're inventing definitions. And I think that's going to ultimately trap people. For example, even the legislative intent of this, it suggests that homestay is synonymous with short-term rental. And again, I appreciate that we're trying to wordsmith this, but those are not synonymous. I don't know anyone that would say that those terms are synonymous. So we're it's confusing. And in that same section, it says homestay will continue to be recognized both as a home occupation, which the way you were talking about it, yes, but the way it's being used, it's not a home occupation. And I'm going directly off my example. I had a property across town that I rented and on short-term basis. That was not a home occupation. So again, I think this gets very complex and hard to follow, and it's because we're really trying to jump through some hoops to make this fit into what we already have with home occupation.
I would like to hear whether Sophie has anything to update us about the sort of legality question.
Yeah, I really appreciate Counselor Kenny's point of view. I took his email, the ordinance, the proposed ordinance, to the town attorney to get some guidance, because every once in a while I can be thinking things, and wanted to get clarification. Unfortunately, by focusing on facility, you're missing the overarching thing that makes us different, which is transient. And I went to town council several years ago and said, Airbnbs are popping up all over the place. Do you want me to enforce the ordinance, or are we going to change the ordinance to allow the practice? And the answer at that point was, do not try to enforce this, because it will be hit and miss and probably not fair. At this point, let's go ahead and try to create a mechanism where people can have short-term rentals. So I appreciate your interest in chapter 8. In the land use ordinance, it very clearly defines travelers accommodations as being for transient. Airbnbs are for transient use. And what we've heard during the 5 years that we've been talking about this has been that transient use creates a different risk profile in terms of public safety than long-term rentals, and that owner occupied rentals have a different risk profile and need to look at things as opposed to non-owner occupied rentals. So I think if this is a path that council wants to go down, we should kick this back to committee for more discussion and have the town attorney here, because I don't try to play a town attorney on TV, might look like it sometimes. But there was no nuance in his advice to us. There was no, but maybe. It was a firm, absolutely, right now, Airbnbs that are not owner occupied are not allowed as a land use in Orono.
I guess to clarify, I don't say I'm focusing on facility, I'm just including it in that, because it's included. I'm not singling it out, but I'm saying you can't single out transient, which you're saying, attorney, if the attorney says you can. As I mentioned, we spoke, I'm certain I could find an attorney that would say the opposite, but and your point was, well, why do we have a town attorney? So I hear you. But I'll let someone else speak.
Well, I guess as I listen to that, I also think about the distinction between like, are we splitting hairs talking about, was it like to the question of, was it legal? Was it illegal? Are we bringing it into legality, or are we doing something that wasn't strictly necessary? For me, the larger intent of this ordinance is to respond to, one, the thing that Sophie's mentioning about a different risk profile, but two, what we heard very clearly from community members as we made our way through this 5-year process, which is that community members who live in residential neighborhoods where both long and short-term rentals may exist are very, very invested in how those properties are managed by the town and what safeguards are in place to try to maintain the harmony and balance in neighborhoods. And so knowing that Airbnbs and similar type of short-term rentals are very dissimilar from long-term rentals. Long-term rentals have their own set of issues, but they operate in a dissimilar way in terms of impact to the neighborhood. That this ordinance seeks to address some of those concerns in splitting the definitions between homestay 1 and homestay 2 and how this is looked at by the town. So for me, there's the question of, I mean, we can talk about, an attorney might say this, attorney might say that. I personally have full faith and confidence in our town attorney, and I don't have any problems with that. But also there's the other question of, well, right, but what about the content? Whether it was strictly necessary or not is one question, but also the content of what this ordinance does aim to do is another question.
Good.
But for other counselors, I don't know.
Can I just ask a question on that? Can you clarify what you mean by impact to neighborhoods being different by one versus the other, and where are you getting that information? What sort of data would support what you're saying the different impacts are?
In terms of what it's like to live next door to, say, a long-term rental that is going to be the same group of people that are there for 365 days at minimum versus a property where it might be different people coming in every weekend or a week or just a month and then they're gone, or.
So yeah, what is it? What is
These were concerns we heard from residents as we made our way through the process. I would also say my own common sense and experience of living in the world. But I had the same experiences that some of our residents brought to us as well, that can be a different feel and different sets of problems. We also heard, and I don't know if Sophie wants to chime in again on this, but we also did hear we had conversations about the public safety aspect and enforceability of things, and that's how we came into the whole discussion of, you know, homestay two that isn't owner occupied, having a local agent or someone designated within an hour's distance, or these kinds of things, so that there are people who are available to respond if there are issues.
Just from personal experience outside of the town of Orono, I have a home in an unorganized territory. And because we're in an unorganized territory, there's no municipal government. But we have a homeowners association and we meet fairly regularly. And the biggest complaint from our homeowners association, and from me as a member of it, is the short-term rentals. They don't have the same commitment to the neighborhood. They don't know the neighbors. They don't have a sense of what the community expectation is. So I'm not speaking for experience in Orono, but from another situation, it's a very different situation where I'm experiencing it.
Well, I would like to speak for Orono, and for short-term rentals, knowing, I mean, we hear it and we've heard the meetings, issues with the locals, rentals and all of that. I don't know that we've heard any complaints from people for short-term rentals. And I know from managing one, and I know I have one next to me now. I know I've never heard of any issues there. And I have heard of issues with the regular rentals, say. And, you know,
But Leo, I will also say that, like, and I can't, over the last 5 years, I couldn't sit here right now on the spot and tell you what community members said what via email or coming to a meeting. But I also, you know, the ways that I'm sure you're already experiencing and did as a school board member, that people stop you when you're in the line for a coffee, they chat with you when you're picking up kids at school. All of us who were working on this over the course of the 5 years did hear feedback from residents, from friends, neighbors, people down the road at the school, at the coffee shop. It was a topic of conversation anecdotally as do I have data and studies? I suppose we could go out and find some, or I don't know. But like that was, I bring that up to discuss that there is definitely a lot of concern from community members who live here year round about rentals in general. And ongoing conversations about the differences between long-term and short-term rentals. I would love to give Sonia and
Yes.
Rob a chance to chime in.
Thanks. I've got 2 questions. I love Airbnbs. I think they're great. I was curious about the language around not having RVs or yurts or that kind of thing, because I've stayed in an Airbnb yurt and I thought it was great in a different town. And yurt isn't specifically in there, but it says no tents.
Yes.
And I wasn't sure how that would be interpreted or what the town's flexibility around
Yeah.
that would be.
I think that I know we've had people contact us about building having a yurt as their full, you know, I think that would be classified a little differently than the tent.
Okay.
Because I remember looking at it before and thinking, yeah, we could probably permit that as a single family home. What that was aimed at was not permitting things to be used as short-term rentals that we don't now consider dwelling units. So if you couldn't use it as a dwelling unit for a single family home, you wouldn't be able to use it as a short-term rental either. The short-term rental would have to take place in a dwelling unit.
Which I think certainly makes sense, with the exception of, I mean, we live in a place where winter is winter and there are some dwellings that may be suitable for summer habitation that maybe wouldn't be considered a dwelling unit. And I'm curious if there was discussion around that in the previous process of this, or you know, such sort of a summer camp cabin kind of vibe. How would that fit into this?
Well, if it was a cabin and it was a structure,
Yeah.
then that, I mean, it would have to be, I mean, that's more of a building code question of, does it count as a dwelling unit that
Yeah.
can be used? I mean, we have seasonal, there's things in the building code that I'm not as familiar with, but I mean, there's things that separate a seasonal camp from a something that can be used as a permanent residence. So things like that, I think, would be able to be used for a short-term dwelling, even if they weren't to be used for a permanent residence.
Great, that's helpful, that helps me understand.
As for myself, I'm not privy to a lot of the nuanced conversations happening for the last 5 years. I think it's great to be adding in language around a local agent. I think it's important that there is some accountability there. I am curious, if any of you have been part of the process for longer, if you could just say sort of what are the concerns that have been brought up? We've talked about concerns generally about people it's not the same. But just because it's different doesn't sort. So I would love just maybe you don't need to have specific examples cited or anything. I just, I'm curious what are these a few things that people brought up that they're concerned about with this.
One of the things we learned about rentals in general through other conversations about long-term as well, and particularly in contact with public safety, about the experience of both from the neighbor point of view and from the public safety point of view, about when there is an owner on site that tends to be less impactful and disruptive in the neighborhood in terms of all of the things that neighbors might complain about or call to the police about, in terms of noise, in terms of parties, in terms of parking, things that people would find disruptive in their residential neighborhood, that when there is an owner on site, or even the property being kind of run down, or all of these kinds of things, neglected in some way, or not as Tom was saying about the issue where he's part of the homeowners association, but along the same lines of when there is an owner present, those complaints, whether they're being generated anecdotally or whether they're being actually driven to public safety, are much lower, and the ability to sort of solve problems as they come up seems to be greater when there is an owner on site. The next best thing perhaps being an owner that is local, or someone that is local that can respond if there are issues. And that's not specific to short-term rentals, it's rental properties in general. But I think that and Kyle can jump in and correct me if I'm going off base here, but in dividing homestay into the first and second option is to clearly delineate that if there is not someone an owner occupant, that there does need to be someone local for that express purpose.
Yeah, no, I'm totally with you there. I think geographic proximity / occupancy by the owner is helpful and important for all the reasons you stated. I guess so we're sort of trying to accomplish a couple different goals here at once. As I said at the beginning, I'm not really privy to the nuances of the disagreements between Leo saying this is in fact already allowed. Airbnb is already allowed here, according to Chapter 8. I was reading Chapter 2, and it looks like that to me. But again, I'm not a lawyer, and our lawyer said it is different. So
I mean, that's how I view, when I interpret the ordinance and the land use ordinance, if short-term rentals were allowed through the rental registration, then homestay, just the regular homestay as it exists in our ordinance currently, would have never needed to have been created.
Yeah.
Because why would you have needed to create a designation of homestay at all for renting out a bedroom in a single family owner occupied dwelling several years ago, if the rental registration already allowed it? It's, I think, fairly clear that it's when it says transient occupancy in a hotel, motel, inn, bed and breakfast, or other similar lodging facility. A similar lodging facility, when you go to the land use ordinance, under the traveler's accommodation definition, homestay, bed and breakfast, and hotel are all under the same umbrella definition. They are all linked, those three things. So, and when you say traveler's accommodation is a place where travelers or other transient guests, it's defining traveler's accommodations, and with homestay being a subset of traveler's accommodations as a transient type of lodging. So when the rental registration talks about not applying to transient occupancy in a hotel, motel, inn, bed and breakfast, or other similar lodging facility, and the fact that we created that homestay definition in the first place after the rental registration already existed, seems to speak to their different things. And it's because the idea, there's arguments all over the place in cities across the country and courts, and are short-term rentals a residential use or they commercial use? Whatever the answer might be, the way our ordinance looked at them was that they're a hybrid between a lodging, commercial use, and under the home occupation as a residential use, because they take place in a structure that would otherwise be used for a residential purpose. A short-term rental is taking the place of something that would be an owner-occupied home or a long-term rented home or something like that. So it's a sort of hybrid approach. And it exists currently in the land use ordinance as a specific thing. It's defined as a specific thing where it's, you can stay there for 14 days, 2 bedrooms, 4 people. That's what we allow as far as short-term rentals go. So when you start to expand outside of that, that means that, rentals in duplexes or short-term rentals in non-owner occupied homes wouldn't be allowed under a land use ordinance. That was the main point of this, was to allow the activity.
No,
And it's not that we couldn't, we originally, through this whole thing, we originally talked about putting it in the rental registration section. We went away from that because, we looked at what the comp plan said in this existing framework. And that's what we landed on as kind of the better option as far as the home. It's not that it would be impossible to put it in the rental registration. It's just not how it's currently laid out in there.
Can I ask some, sorry.
I have 2 quick questions. One, I know a resident in our town who has an RV, which is listed on Airbnb. There's no occupancy of that RV within Orono. Like the renter comes to Orono, picks up the RV, drives it to Acadia for the week, comes back, drops it off in Orono. So the RV lives in Orono when it's not being rented. There's a transaction that occurs in Orono with this RV. That would seem to make this ongoing business illegal.
Yeah, it seems more like a home business than a home.
Okay.
I think so in the draft ordinance that we read, mobile homes are allowed, so if it's registered as a mobile home, that's allowable, but not a.
But if it's not staying on the property,
Okay.
if they're really just renting out a vehicle at that point.
Right.
How the vehicle is used elsewhere, I think that would be a different issue, and maybe that requires a home business permit or whatever it is, but I don't think that would be something captured here.
Then that's great, because I don't think it was the intent of this to stop businesses. If we only have 5 or 10 ongoing Airbnb enterprises in town at any given time, how many of those are homestay 2 kinds of enterprises? Do we know?
It's hard to say exactly. I tried to look at the descriptions. They're not all clear, whether it's, at least a couple were homestay 1s, and I know at least a couple are homestay 2s. But it was hard to say for sure.
So this ordinance is not designed to preclude or limit a majority business practice or anything like that.
It's not designed to get rid of anything. It's designed to allow things to be legally conforming that currently aren't legally conforming.
Well, I don't know about that, because the main constitution says that enumeration of any one right doesn't impair, deter exercise of other rights retained by the people. So just saying it's not in a permitted state doesn't mean that it can't exist. Right? Like anything that doesn't, you're saying, well, you don't have a permit to do that, so you can't do it, isn't what our constitution says. Our constitution says you can do everything you want, and in certain cases, we have to, for other extenuating circumstances, we have to require a permit. So I guess I'm not as steeped in this conversation as people who've been on council longer. But I guess my caution as I approach it is that I want to make sure that we're not taking a practice that many people have embedded in their economic and social lives in our town and limiting. I don't think the intention of this is to do that, but that may be the unintention or the unintended consequence.
How would it be limited? That's not like a feisty question,
Yeah,
but like,
yeah.
I've heard you've said something along those lines. Leo seemed to be implying that something about this was going to do harm, and I don't see it, so I would like you to help me understand.
I guess my question is, if it's a home, I don't think a homestay one definition limits anybody's. I think homestay twos, where the homeowner's not on site, and it might require other planning review or site planning review, which then could be denied, could potentially limit somebody's ability to exercise the full potential of their property.
So the planning board can't just arbitrarily deny something.
So
we
Oh, I'm gonna let Kyle go first because he's probably smarter than I am.
all I was gonna say is the planning board has set criteria. So just like if someone goes to the planning board similarly for a home business or, whatever, because someone down the street comes to the meeting and says, I don't like, that this is going to, be next to my house, the planning board can't just decide to deny it. If the planning board is really just a more formal code enforcement officer in most cases, they're taking the ordinance criteria and saying this does or doesn't meet, the ordinance. So there's not a lot of subjectivity there of them just making those types of decisions. If it's something that meets the ordinance, they approve it. They hear feedback and there are certain standards that they can add in, conditions, things like that. So if someone was creating a short-term rental and, said, yeah, my goal is to have this occupied every day of the year and people are going to be turning over, every 3 days, and I'm going to build a 10-space parking lot on my property because, I'm hoping that large families come and stay at my property, in some scenic lot in town. The planning board could say, well, that doesn't feel like a residential neighborhood, that, like the other houses on the street. So I think you should put some landscaping to screen the parking area. That's really where the subjective nature of the planning board comes in.
Sophie, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to Jeff's statement, because the town has the right to allow with restriction or not allow certain land uses in certain places, which is what they've done here. The idea that because currently we don't allow it in our table of uses, that it means that the use can be rampant without regulation is just not the way the courts look at the way municipalities zone.
So this, if it were to move to homestay, this is another, I think, issue that doesn't make sense from a rental property perspective. I think so. If we make this change, and I have a unit that I want to become a short-term rental. I go to the planning board, right?
It depends what zoning district you mean, but possibly.
Medium density residential and
Yes.
okay, so I go through the planning board and who else has to approve it? Town council?
No.
Just the planning board, one time.
Correct.
So that's off in rental in perpetuity until somebody comes forward and changes something.
Yeah, just like every other land use.
But it's not like every other rental. We register every year
So
to be in the rental program, and I think that fits more with how,
So with home
These should work.
occupations, all home occupations, home offices, home businesses, they get a form every year to fill out that's just, hey, are you still doing this? So it would, because it falls under that home occupation, that's sort of the point, is you would get that yearly check-in, similar to a rental registration, where you're saying, yes, we're still doing this.
and again, I think this fits more appropriately with the rental registration. You pay your $25. Yes, I'm still doing this, and it fits over there. The other, so also, would it, if I'm a person that wants to rent out a bedroom in my house, that's homestay one, correct? And same deal, I have to go through the planning board for that?
No, all homestay ones would be perfect. So any owner occupied situation where you're renting out, you're a bedroom in your house, or you're going on vacation and, you're returning in a week, but that week that you're gone, you're renting out the house. Those would fall under homestay one, and those are just permits. So you just go to code enforcement, get the one-time permit, you have your, yearly check-in sort of thing. The planning board would only be for the non-owner occupied homestays in zoning districts that are primarily residential.
So if I want to take in a college student for the year, have them come and stay 10 months, whatever, I just go get a permit, they can live in that bedroom, is that how that would work? Or does it 14-day thing come into play there?
A short-term rental is 30 days or less. So if you were doing it for 10 months, you would do the rental registration because that person is living there on a long-term basis. That's how we defined it. It's the short-term rental, the homestay is 30 days or less.
But if you're renting your bedroom to a nurse practitioner student who's doing a 1 week rotation up here and needs a bedroom to stay in for 1 week, then that would be the homestay one with just a permit.
Traveling nurse 3 months, that's a rental registration.
And I think that, again, to go back to Rob's question about like, well, what's the difference? Well, I mean, when you look at a homestay one, what you're looking at is someone's individual economic liberties. When you're looking at a homestay two, you're looking at someone who is creating an economic enterprise out of owning short-term rentals. And so that doesn't mean it's bad. I mean, that could be that you, Leo Kenny, own 5 buildings in town and you want to have Airbnbs in all of them, and you're just making a little extra money for yourself. And there's nothing like sinister about that. But it can also mean that a large scale developer decides they want to come in here and buy up a lot of properties and turn them all into Airbnbs, and then maybe like go back to New York and just let it whatever, and no one's responsible for, there's no local agent, there's nobody, I mean, like, there's a different, there's one of the things that came up in our conversation about why to have this distinction is that it is a different activity when someone is not owner occupied potentially, if it's a multiple thing. It can be a different situation than when it's just somebody who's renting out a part of the home that they live in terms of the commercial activity.
Right, and all of those types of concerns are all covered in the rental registration program. The someone local, that just changed, right? So that applies to the rental registration program.
Right, but there's also a difference between a home that someone's gonna make their home for a full calendar year versus a structure where it's more operating like a hotel room or a motel room that happens to be in a residential house in a residential neighborhood, and you have people coming and going potentially. So those are also different things. Ultimately, we are kind of getting into the weeds. And so I think at this point, we need to make a decision about, does council want to bring this back to committee with the town attorney? Is council comfortable moving it forward? Because I'm not sure we're actually gonna solve anything or definitively answer any questions tonight. The question is, what is our next step? I can personally start off by saying I'm fully comfortable moving it back to the meeting for a vote. That's just me, but
I'm
Okay, moving it back to a vote.
I'm sorry,
I'm okay moving it back to a vote.
I am too.
Yeah, I mean. I would be ready to, I'm not ready to vote on it tonight, but I think I could be ready to vote on it. Particularly if I'm able to, then Sophie's here, Kyle's here, if I have further questions. I don't know that more discussion is going to substantively change anybody's opinion.
I'm comfortable moving it to a vote as well. Okay, so we will put it back on an agenda. Sophie, what agenda will we put it on?
So this was tentatively scheduled for the 8th, which is next week. If people need more time, we could do September 12th.
Is there a preference for August or September? I have none. Jeff? How much ear bending do you need to do in the next week?
Well, we look at it. I think it's fine. I think we can do this. I don't know how that works.
Okay, so it sounds like we could do the 8th. All right, and I am remiss, I didn't ask last time, forgive me, because this is the first time I've chaired my committee since we changed the public comment rules, but if any member of the public has any input on this item, they can raise their digital hands now. We don't have any physical people in here.
I don't see any hands raised, Megan.
Okay, thank you, Bella. All right, well, let's move on to our next item. Where is my agenda? I have now lost the plot here. Oh, no, it's right here. Thank you. So item C, review of proposed contract zone for Tyler Technology, 5 College Avenue, post planning board public hearing. And I don't know if the rest of council had the opportunity to tune into that hearing, but it was interesting to listen to and very informative. How much intro do we need? Kyle, would you like to sort of give the high points of the memo?
Yeah, I'll just kind of briefly summarize it. So the contract zone and application for the Tyler Technologies project on 5 College Ave, the University in-law, went to the planning board for a public hearing. It was, reviewed in 2 parts. The planning board gives a recommendation on the contract zone agreement, because eventually that's council's decision whether to approve that agreement and zone change. And then the planning board also reviewed the project itself from the site plan application point of view and made findings based on that application. So just to kind of hit the, what the result was, is the planning board approved the site plan with a few conditions. The biggest one, obviously, the council eventually approves the contract zone to change the zone to allow the office in the first place. Yeah, I thought it was a pretty productive meeting. There were a number of members of the sort of surrounding neighborhoods, University Place, College Ave, Webster area. We had a couple comments ahead of time. I think largely the comments that were made, as I mentioned in the memo, were more geared towards the site plan side of things rather than the contents of the contract zone itself. So I'm not sure how much of that is really relevant to council's review of the contract document or making any changes to that. I think most of the concerns were that people had were about things like noise, lighting, traffic moving into the parking area, what sort of hours of operation are there? Are lights going to be coming into people's windows, those sorts of things. At the end of the meeting, the planning board made a condition of approval that the applicant would work with town staff to kind of further create a bigger buffer along some of the property lines there that abut the residential properties, either through fencing or vegetation. So, that conversation is sort of ongoing and would happen before any building permits were actually obtained. But beyond that, I mean, the project, met all the ordinance standards, it met all of the contract zone standards. The planning board, I think felt like it met the goals of the comprehensive plan. A number of our planning board members were part of the comprehensive plan committee and remember talking about those specific lots that were identified as being right for that contract zone change. That lot being one of them. So I thought they were interested in seeing that come forward. Yeah, they recommended the contract zone go back to council. There were no proposed changes. So it brings us to where we are.
Sylvie?
Before you kick this off to discussion, Megan, I just want to remind folks that just as I caution Kyle all the time that planning board has a lane and planning board's decisions have to be informed by the ordinances that council adopts. This time I'm cautioning you that council has a lane. And it is not council's job to reiterate the site plan efforts. The project went through site plan review. The planning board made decisions. You can make amendments to the comp plan, the contract zone document before you go to public hearing. Minor changes, anything major would have to go back through the planning board process. But this is not a time for council to be re-evaluating whether or not the planning board got it right in terms of issues related to site plan. There are also, I think, some concerns around what happens during construction that is already managed in our ordinances and would be part of any building permits that we issue.
I would just add that, we attached the rendering from the planning board application. I mean, that's really what the building would look like. That's not just a visual, this is an idea, that's what the building is, the materials, the scale. I mean, so that, yes, that was a result of the site plan application, but that site plan application was developed under the constraints of the contract zone. So, I mean, and the natural conditions of the lot, but, the fact that it's at the top of the slope in, roughly the same spot of where the hotel is and, the parking area is, a slightly smaller impervious area but in roughly the same spot and, the lawn going down to the river kind of remains untouched, except, they're looking to move the pathway down more along the tree line. All of that stuff is really a result of the kind of limitations put in through the contract. So.
The only concern that I've heard raised from anybody about this is in fact around construction. And if we feel confident that is adequately addressable through existing ordinance, then that's great.
So,
But
so I want to make it really clear that construction next door is always going to be unpleasant. There isn't a lot you can do. Nails need to get hammered. Big pieces of equipment will be backing up. It will not be ideal. We have ways to address dust. We have ways to address hours of operation. When we get complaints, we can try to navigate those complaints in more of a voluntary compliance kind of way or dispute resolution kind of way with our code officer. But people have the right to construct on their property. And not everybody likes that. And I get it. I'm living at the end of a street right now that is all ripped up and it is not a pleasure, but it is something that needs to happen.
yeah, I think it's important that there is respect paid to those who abut the property. And figure out if there are things that can be done to mitigate the harm or the unpleasantness, we absolutely should be willing to do.
So we do have a pre-construction after planning board before building permits are obtained for larger projects like this. we do always have a pre-construction meeting between staff where it really turns over from the planning review into the actual construction stage and more code enforcement takes over, and the meeting between staff and, you know, applicant representatives and the contractors and all of those people to talk about all of that and have that conversation and, where the sensitive areas are and what the allowed hours of operation are in the ordinance and the noise levels and, the fact that you're in an MS4 community and you can't be having, dirt and things blowing all over the place into the water and on the street and all of that stuff. So there is a formal conversation before anything takes place to pass along some of that and try to work together.
That's great. Yeah, I only bring up, it's the only thing that I've heard about this from community members.
Yeah.
I think this is great. I'm for this.
And I'd like to, I guess, just reiterate that, as I've gotten some of that feedback from folks in my neighborhood as well, and reiterate that I think it is. It's not too much for us to ask and to suggest to the folks at Tyler developing this, that it would be a really good move for them to try to, be good citizens of this community and play as nice with the neighbors as they can.
Yeah.
I think it'll smooth the way going forward to be erecting kind of the nicest sound barrier that seems reasonable.
So-
I would just add that having the conversation with Tyler through this process is that
Mhm.
that's their goal.
Great.
They want to be good neighbors, they want
Mhm.
to work with the community, and they're not interested in moving in and upsetting it.
Yeah,
And that has been reiterated over and over again through our conversations. So
It's wonderful to hear.
So I appreciate the work that staff has done in developing this contract zone. I'm very enthusiastic about the project and I'm excited to move forward with it.
Yeah, my biggest question, and I think it's reflected here in Kyle's memo of some of the feedback that has nothing to do with the site plan review part that was received from residents about what a contract zone might lead to in the future, and that's always a discussion that we have when we're considering a contract zone. And I feel really confident. I mean, there are items like the discussion of off-street parking requirements in the contract, that the goal of using village commercial is, as the base zoning district, is to encourage alternative methods of transportation such as biking and walking. And I think that this is one of those instances where I think I worried a little bit less about what could happen if we turned this into a contract zone, because the whole purpose of, the underlying village commercial districts as the underlying zone is to reflect that there is a very specific way that this property can kind of fit into the local community. That's really in line with our comp plan goals and the goals that a lot of our residents state as their own goals. So I feel excited and happy to move forward with this as well. Before I check in on the public, does council have anything else to add?
One comment, two questions. That rendering looks, I think, incredible. I think What a great looking building, and it's gonna be really nice to see. But I did have a question with the minimum, it says minimum 60 parking spots. Is there a maximum? I mean, or does that just mean we're putting in a minimum and they can do whatever? It
So
sounds like that was addressed, because you just said it's gonna be less impervious space, but it's not really in that contract.
Yeah, so we don't have anything in our ordinance at all about maximum parking. The village commercial doesn't have a minimum requirement for businesses for parking at all. So what we wanted to do with that specifically was, and the reason that exists is because we have a Pine Tree parking lot, and, so businesses can take advantage downtown of the available public parking options. That's why it's not required that every downtown business has their own off-street parking. For them, they're a little further away from downtown. We talked with them about how much parking they expected to actually need and how many employees they were expecting, and created a minimum off of that. So they weren't going to have, even if we said, there's no minimum parking requirement, they would have proposed the same thing. But it was basically just enforcing going forward that, okay, if you're gonna have an office building of this scale, you have to maintain at least, this base minimum of parking, so you don't have a situation where you have loads of people coming into this office and nowhere for them to park their cars, but it's substantially less than what would have been required under the normal office.
So there is no maximum there, but they, I assume, are probably bound by being on that side of the building, or they probably can't develop any parking on the riverside, I assume. Is that implied, or is it like they can't, or like,
Yeah, that's
Do
more
the
of the feasibility. So the contract specifies you can't have more than 3,000 square feet of the building go into the shoreland zone. So the shoreland pretty much is the whole hill up. They kept the building out of the shoreland completely. But if they went any further down the hill, you'd hit that shoreland area. So, yeah, the contract doesn't specify that specifically that nothing could be there, but just from a practical standpoint of developing down the slope, it would be very difficult. The site sort of naturally confines the development to that area.
I guess if there's no maximum, there's no maximum, there's no maximum, and it goes to maximum. I didn't understand that, or I didn't know that was the case. The only other question was, a 10-foot buffer from the property line on Route 2. Sounds really close to Route 2 to me for a building of that size. So is there, but I don't know where the right of way ends.
No, so the building has a 20-foot setback. It's the same setback as the MDR. The 10-foot setback is the vegetated buffer,
Oh,
and that's just for screening purposes.
okay.
And that's consistent with what our
Oh, okay.
ordinance
Gotcha. I
requires.
I thought that was the building. and
No,
that
no.
seemed- That seemed, wow. Gotcha. Thank you.
So the setbacks follow in the contract. It requires that the building follows MDR level setbacks, except for the rear property line, which it's more strict to keep it away from that back residential property.
Got it. Thank you.
Other questions from council before hearing from the public? Belle, would you like to promote John to speak?
Sure.
Am I unmuted now?
You are.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to say thank you for giving us a chances
I'm
to,
so sorry, John. Do you mind pausing just to introduce yourself for the record?
I'm sorry, sure. I'm John Jemison. I live at 8 University Place. And I just wanted to say that, I don't know what all of the rules are associated with the construction process. So one of the things that I was certainly hoping for was at least a temporary, fairly significant fence that could be moved around when they needed to do stuff, but it would at least block some of the noise, because although Sophie says that she lives on the street that the construction's been going on all summer, and I appreciate that, everybody on that street ends up with a better sewer system at the end of the day, right? Poop is not going to come back in Sophie's house or anybody else's house that's on that street. And that is a beautiful thing. I am completely supportive. When it's private industry coming in and one can't be in their house for 5 days a week, it seems it's a little bit like apples and oranges, right? Because they're going to get all the advantage of, and the town will get this great advantage of this nice building. And I'm not saying it's not a nice building. I'm not saying it's not going to be a better land use. I would agree that it probably was, and it probably is, but there is a direct impact to us that being a creative humans, that we will not really be able to be in our house for 5 days a week. And I wanted to confirm what were the times that they can start construction? What is the time that they have to quit construction? Can they construct on the weekends? Can they not construct on the weekends? Because all of that was not elucidated at the planning board meeting. And so I just think that it's a little bit different when you change a zone and it's a private industry that's going to get all of the benefit from it, and the people that are living there have to take it on the chin for 2 years. And if you think it's going to be less than 2 years, I think we're all dreaming because of the backups and everything else that's happened with COVID and everything else. It's going to be a lot longer process than this, and it will be terribly disruptive. But thank you for your time.
Thank you, John. Sophie?
So I want to be sensitive to John's concerns, and I don't think we can rewrite ordinances, but we most definitely can have Pat reach out to John, review the plans, and talk with John about his specific concerns and what issues he has. And with that, we can outline what the ordinance says, but we can also take those concerns to our pre-construction meeting and see what we could do there. There's a difference between making people do things and asking people to work with us, which I will say Tyler has been really flexible, wanting to work with the town thus far. So I think this is workable. I understand John's concerns. And I think the way to address those is going to be with Pat prior to the pre-construction meeting.
Thank you, Sophie. Other members of the public who wish to speak? I don't see any hands raised. So it sounds like we're comfortable moving this forward.
So the timeline for this would be public hearing on the 8th. It has been noticed already. That gets adoption either with or without minor revision on September 12th. And then allows the parties to move forward with the pre-construction process.
All right, thank you very much. And finally, I know it feels like we've been in my committee for 100 years, but we're approaching the last item, which is item D, review of draft proposed ordinance revisions to minimum parking standards. Kyle?
Right, so we talked about this idea previously at committee, that our off-street parking standards specifically for residential uses just didn't make a whole lot of sense. The comp plan made a recommendation to look at it. You know, the current requirement is that every dwelling unit, no matter the size, no matter the zone, every dwelling unit has to provide 3 off-street parking spaces regardless. And I think when you're looking at this, you know, if you look at, you know, B1A there, I think you can read that in a couple of different ways. And I think if you read it in a negative tone, you get why that the 3 was used. And it's because, you know, okay, you're having all of these rental properties where you have a lot of unrelated people and they're all going to drive. So we need to require that every dwelling unit across the town provide at least 3 parking spaces on the off chance that, you know, each of them might be rented out at some point. So we always have adequate parking for every single dwelling unit. But what that does is it requires people who aren't in that situation to build parking that they might not need. It, you know, limits development in any number of ways. When we start talking about, you know, denser housing projects with cluster developments or multifamily that have a larger number of dwelling units in the project itself, that 3 parking space per unit number, you know, quickly adds up to some really large parking areas that make some pretty big on the ground impacts, especially when we were just talking about low impact development just you know, a few agenda items ago. So the actual, you know, change to the ordinance would be fairly small. I mean, really, we're just saying that, you know, previously it said new dwelling units, you need 3 spaces per unit, except for efficiency apartments, which are studios, you know, needing 2 spaces per unit. The change would take it down to efficiency apartments and dwelling units with 1 bedroom to only being required to have 1 space per unit. And dwelling units with 2 or more bedrooms needing 2 spaces per unit. Now, if someone like, you know, the Ave or Reserve or something at that scale where they're building, you know, many bedrooms per unit came in and, you know, with that model and wanted to build 4 spaces per dwelling unit, they could. Nothing in there would prevent them from doing so. But for people looking to build, you know, small scale, single family homes or, you know, studio, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom apartments, you know, it could potentially add up to make a really big difference as far as the amount of money it would cost to develop and maintain that parking area. And also the impact of just the scale of that size parking area on the ground. And the idea here is that, you know, we didn't really look at zoning playing a role. You know, when you consider this change in town, you're kind of preserving more space that could be further developed for either more housing or businesses or whatever to create that more walkable environment. And when you're talking about, you know, what this would look like in, you know, the agriculture district, you're talking about more land that could be preserved as open space and things like that. So it really would apply differently, but equally as well, kind of no matter where it was in town. So the next steps, if council was in favor of the amendment and moving it forward, would be to take it to the planning board public.
Folks?
I'm in favor of taking it to the planning board. I think it's a good change.
Yeah, me too. Onward.
I agree.
I'm in favor. I think being cognizant and I'm in favor of it for all those reasons. I think it's a good idea, but you know, I wonder what happens if this results in several new streets being lined with cars all the time for parking.
Not from November to.
Not
April.
from November, but I mean, there is the rest of the season when they could be. I guess there's no parking signs.
So we have the mechanisms through code and law enforcement to deal with the parking in place, you know, deal with enforcing, though aren't any of our ordinances regarding. So,
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking that, you know, we all want to be optimistic and think, okay, they're gonna have 1 car per family, and so this should be great. And then when it doesn't perhaps work out that way, then there's a parking issue. And obviously during the winter, they're off the road, and that's maybe deters that issue to some degree. But it also could mean that during summer months, a lot more roads have fuel parking.
So the idea with this and, you know, lots of other communities the past several years looking at their off-street parking requirements is to, you know, put the burden or the question on the property. If you don't have to build 1 space or 2 spaces. If you're, you know, buying a new property in town and you're going to rent it out and you plan to rent it out to 3 people, well, then you should provide the parking for those 3 people. And if you can't for some reason, whether it's the feasibility of the way the lot is situated or, you know, whatever it is, you know, and then you rent it out to 3 people anyway, I mean, that's an enforcement issue then.
Plus, most of the town's already been built under the old parking restrictions, right?
Right, honestly, this would bring a lot of non-conforming
Yeah.
parking situations.
Yeah, no, I like it.
And for new
overall.
construction, it would be a benefit.
Something I just cognizant of that.
Sure.
When, you know, just like any change, if all of a sudden now you live on Gilbert Street, whatever, and people are parking on the road, not a good example, but anywhere, people parking on the road, it irritates people, and we'll hear about it, and then I guess we deal with it with, again, no, we can alter streets, I assume, with no parking beside the street and things like that, so. I like it, we support it.
Okay, sounds like we're ready to send it to the planning board. Do any members of the public want to weigh in? But I see Sophie's hand also. All right, doesn't look like we have any public comment, Sophie.
Yeah, I just wanted to review the timeline here. We have missed the August planning board for this matter, so this will be on the September planning board. for a public hearing and a recommendation from the planning board, which means you will see it back here for October.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Kyle, and I will gladly pass the baton back to our finance committee chair.
Such a tough role this evening. Mine's pretty easy. Item A is going to be postponed at Sophie's request, which was review of the draft town ordinance, chapter 2 revision related to procurement procedures. And item B is an update on implementation of LD 290, adopted legislation that freezes property taxes for senior citizens. I hope everybody saw Paul Smith's letter to the editor in Saturday's paper, Orono resident, that wrote a letter commenting on this particular piece of legislation. Very interesting.
So this is me today, because as much as we'd like to make this an assessing issue, it's really a tax collection issue. The Constitution of the state of Maine requires that all property be assessed at fair market value. So the legislature didn't change how it was assessed, but rather it has a mechanism between assessment and the billing, which makes it my issue. So a lot of people have heard about LD 290. The intent, as stated for this program, is to stabilize or freeze the amount of local property taxes that citizens pay, theoretically, while holding municipalities harmless related to the loss of property tax revenue. Ready to move? So this piece of legislation kind of snuck in under the wire. LD 290 was approved in 2022. It has been assigned to the Maine Department of Revenue Services to oversee. And it is in addition to other property tax programs, circuit breaker, senior deferral programs, and other need-based programs. Ready to move? So one of the things you're going to hear as we talk about this that will get confusing, and if it doesn't get confusing for you, I'm going to be surprised, because among staff, we have to back up and remind ourselves that in Orono, we assess property taxes based on a fiscal year. So that is for a period of time, July 1 to June 30. Based on state law, the assessment date is April 1st. So the assessment is made based on who owns the property and the value of the property as of April 1st of the year that the taxes are levied. So, for example, when you talk to me, you hear about property taxes for FY23, meaning the year we're coming up on, we're getting ready to commit taxes and send out bills that will be due September of 2022 and February of 2023. If you talk to the assessor and many state agencies, they're talking about the assessment for April 1, 2022, which would be the FY23 tax bill. So when we move through this presentation, understand that the tax bill, the applications that are due by December 1st of 2022 are used to stabilize the FY24 property tax bill, which is based on ownership and value on April 1, 2023. So in December, when we get that application, we are talking about stabilizing at your FY23 rate or tax bill that would then be applied to FY24. Does that make sense? So who's eligible? This is always the question, right? So you have to be a permanent Maine resident. So in Maine, that means you have to live here for more than 6 months a year and not declare any place else your residence. You need to be at least 65 years old on the following April 1st. So if you're submitting an application for this December 2022, you have to be at least 65 years old on April 1st, 2023. So it's forward looking. You have to be eligible for the homestead. There are all sorts of questions that I can't answer around that right now, but what the program says is you have to be eligible to receive a homestead exemption on the property that you're claiming the stabilization for. And you have to have owned a homestead as defined by state law that talks about homestead exemptions in Maine for at least 10 years. The way this is written, I'm not sure that this means you had to have had a homestead exemption for the last 10 years, but that is something that is not completely hammered out for us yet. So let's go back to eligibility. So one of the things that you're seeing here, there is absolutely nothing in this legislation that talks about income levels or any other standards. If you meet these 4 elements, you qualify, you would be deemed to qualify. Now, with every rule, there are exceptions, and we're still trying to work through some of the places that we've given homestead exemptions to. We're now wondering if we have given them an error or how we're going to move forward with this program. So, yep.
I asked a question on the eligibility.
Yeah,
Out of curiosity, does it mean you have to have had the same homestead exemption for 10 years? Or as long as you were?
nope, and it doesn't have to be consecutive. So you could have had 5 years of a homestead, gone off and had it venture someplace else and come back and have owned a homestead for 5 more years.
Huh.
And you're gonna see it's also portable between communities. Okay,
Yeah, thank you.
so how does it work? The applications are due by December 1st of each year. Town staff is responsible for determining eligibility. My sense is that this is going to be a collaborative effort between tax collection staff and assessing staff because as you will see, we have some database issues that we'll talk about in a few minutes. If the applicant is found eligible, the tax bill is frozen at the previous year's amount. So if somebody forgets and doesn't submit their application by December 1st, then they're not stabilized. When they come back and submit it the next year, they would be stabilized at the previous year's level. You don't get to go back. So the property continues to be assessed and valued based on fair market value, but the tax collector's responsibility is to adjust the bill to the previous year. So once the bill is sent, the tax collector collects that frozen amount from an eligible participant. We are responsible for tracking all of the properties in the program, what the stabilized amount is, and how much would otherwise have been assessed. We have to file a report by November 1st of each year, and the state reimburses the town for the revenue that we would have otherwise collected if the property hadn't been stabilized. We should get that by January 15th of the following year. So I'm going to say this again. Property owners must apply each year by December 1st. Town staff is required to determine who is eligible each year. The frozen amount is based on the amount that was paid in the previous year. So again, if you miss an application, you're resetting the frozen amount for future years. And these are like homestead exemption documents or veteran exemption documents. We are not allowed to just kind of fudge it and say, well, they meant to, and we'll put it in. We can ask the state if they'll accept it, but where we're taking money from the state, we have to follow the program guidelines. Okay. So this is where it gets kind of sticky. People don't always tend to buy a piece of property and stay there in perpetuity. So when we think about going back 10 years, it means to determine eligibility, we are gonna have to go back essentially to perhaps previous towns that they may have owned a homestead in to determine eligibility. But it also means that once the stabilized value is calculated, as long as they keep applying every year, that stabilized value is portable. So for example, Lakeview Plantation does not have very many services. The ones that they have, they get from the town of Brownville. And they pride themselves on their mill rate of 3. So an average home in Lakeview, let's just say 300,000, they're paying $900 a year in property tax. They come by that same, by a $250,000 property in Orono, and the delta on that is almost $5,000. So it's portable. We're gonna have to track it, and it will, I can't tell you what that delta is gonna be because it really depends on who moves in and what they buy for property.
Between that and the lack of income guidelines, that sounds like it's inviting people to do some things with their real estate transactions. Huh.
I would not say that, but I would not disagree.
Okay. I will say it so that you don't have to.
So, you know, in general, the idea of reducing people's property taxes is not a bad idea. The problem is that when we engage in the process of exemptions or stabilizations or things like that, unless you dramatically reduce the cost of services and the amount of tax dollars that you are collecting, somebody's got to pay that bill somewhere. So right now, the state is suggesting in the statutory language that they're going to reimburse us at 100%. The fiscal note that I saw on the original bill was something like $300,000. The media has done some research, and I don't know how valid that research is, having been the subject of the media. But they're estimating that it's like between $4 and $5 million a year. And so what the town's historic experience with the state of Maine is when things get expensive and they like the program, because who is going to suddenly tell seniors that their property is no longer going to be stabilized? The way that they fund it is by rolling back that % reimbursement. So it's not there now, but this is simply statutory language, which can be altered as part of the state's budget adoption on an annual basis. And there's nothing in the statute that says the only way this program can be rolled out for a year is if the state funds it at 100%. So that's something that I'm concerned about.
Much like revenue sharing and funding education, I'm also concerned about it.
I'm also a little bit concerned about the staff time and processes to spent determining eligibility, tracking, and reporting. So if this were set up more like income eligible, we have a mechanism in place to be able to bring forward, much like poverty abatements or general assistance. Either you meet an income threshold or you don't. This one, I think it will be really easy for people who have lived in Orono for a very long time. It is going to be more difficult with people who have moved in within the last 10 years, because now we're going to be trying to trace and track and be able to certify, because we're getting money. So the state's not going to just accept because they said so. And then the time reporting this. My major concern is we have 2 very complex internal software programs, one that values and would potentially put an exemption, could potentially put an exemption on property. And then one that value rolls into and manages our tax collection process. Our software currently does not have the mechanism to freeze and track. So right now, our financial software company is working to try to come up with a solution before we all start committing taxes next year, not this year. And the track record with that is not great for people who were on council when we rolled in this new financial software. So I'm a little bit nervous about that, but again, it's a matter of scale. If we have 20 people apply, that's easy to manage on a spreadsheet and to make handmade tax bills. When we start looking at a few hundred, that now becomes much more cumbersome to do and requires a lot of manual adjustments to tax accounts, which we try to avoid from a best practice standpoint. So those are my questions or concerns. We can go to the next. So the takeaways for the community to think about, that the applications are available. They're on the main revenue service website. They will be on the town of Orono website. I think we're going to try to connect them to the front page. And if people prefer hard copies are available at the town clerk's office. Applications must be submitted to the town office no later than December 1st, 2022. We're also going to be asking for proof of age. So kind of think about that when you're submitting your application. The stabilization program does not kick in until FY24 or next year's tax bill. And people have to reapply by December 1st each year. And the takeaways for town council, because while you are community members and may or may not qualify for this program, I'd also like you to just think about what might work or what the concerns are here. So number one, the applications are publicly available. If you have people ask you about this program, I don't think you need to be the expert in it, other than to drive them to the town clerk's office, the website, and the application process. And remember, December 1st is a hard deadline. We will be doing some community outreach with regard to this. We just got the applications last week, so we have not gone through that yet. And there probably will be a lag this year as we work through trying to certify people. I envision that we're going to be reaching out to the state for some assistance working through this project. So as we talked about before, I'm kind of concerned about the lack of support within our existing software program. This kind of came up all of a sudden, and our software has not moved to the time. And then the last one is that the state legislature often talks about ages. There's now a new lien process where we have to consider people over a certain age get a different lien process. There is nothing when you transfer property or as you go through the town process with taxation. There's absolutely nothing in that process that asks your age. So it is not information that we would normally have. And because all of our information is public with regard to tax bills and ownership records, we would be kind of concerned to add those to the record, simply because then now people can get more personal information about folks. So there are lots of unknowns, and I think in general, the idea of the program to freeze the tax bill so that older folks can stay in their homes is a laudable idea. We're just trying to figure out how we can work through this. And luckily we have some time.
Wait, it's just such a shame. I mean, like it's such a great opportunity to use state funds in a very targeted way to help people specifically that need help. And it just seems like the execution of this is going to make that extremely difficult.
So the letter to the editor in Saturday's paper, it might have been, oh, it was Saturday, that I was referring to by Paul Smith. Was very critical of the bill in terms of no income requirement, saying that it makes sense for some people, but to say that everybody, regardless of income, is eligible for this just does not make sense. He was also critical of the fact that it ignores situations like his, where he lives in a Dirigo Pine cottage, and they don't get tax bills individually. Dirigo Pine gets tax bills, and then the Dirigo Pines organization assesses the individual occupant of the cottage. So there's a group, and there are many of those facilities around the state that house people over 65, and those people would not have any eligibility. And he had some other comments about it, but he ends it by saying that he hopes there's going to be some action in an upcoming legislative session to change this law, because it's a terrible law. And I wonder if you've heard of any movement on MA's part to get involved in that process.
So I think MMA is moving in steps with this. I think the first step was to try to get clarification as the state rolled out the applications, and to make sure that municipal officials knew what their role was and knew why this wasn't unconstitutional, which had been debated fiercely among assessors. And then the next step is to try to take back some fixes. And the last thing I will say is this piece of legislation was introduced by Senator Trey Harold Stewart III, also known as Trey, who was the town council liaison to student government during his time at the town of Orono. So people who've been on council for a long time, if you saw him, you would recognize him. I have given him a little bit of a hard time.
Any comments or questions from the group?
You mentioned a few hundred. Were you just kind of guessing, or can we relatively easily look and say there's a few hundred people over 65 that own property?
So
It's a guess.
my guess would be, if you look at the total demographic in Orono, our over 65 population rivals our 18 to 24 population. So I would guess that there are 2,000 or 3,000 over 65s living in Orono. Do I think they all own property? No. Do I think that many of them are probably duos? Probably. So I think a few hundred, 200, 300, 400 is probably, if we do a good job promoting this. And, you know, I have a hard time as a town manager not promoting this to the hilt if members of my community can benefit.
Thank you.
Or our
Anything else?
community.
Anything else from the group? Thank you for the update. Anything further on manager's report, Sophie?
I do have just a couple of brief things. The first, last week, MRC held its quarterly meeting and introduced Revere Capital as the equity partner that we are bringing to the table. We have executed an exclusivity arrangement with Revere, with the plan to buy the property this coming month. MRC would buy the property and then work with Revere to sell most of our interest in the property and get the Hamden Coastal Facility plant back up and running. So as there are still lots of unknowns with this, and the thing I will leave you with as media coverage comes out is no partner is perfect. The partners that partners pick are not perfect. At the end of the day, we need some deep pockets that are committed to getting this plant back up and going. And it truly is what's in the best interest for the municipalities in our region, both MRC members and non-members. So I would encourage you to keep the lookout, but just like I said about the media, maybe not necessarily believe everything you read in the Bangor Daily News. The last thing I have, and I'm just trying to bring it back up, I apologize. In my, so I have been an active participant in the Diversity Hiring Coalition of Maine since last October. This is a great group of people from around the state, primarily in southern Maine, both state government, nonprofits, nonprofits working with new Mainers and others, people with disabilities and other folks that sometimes have a challenge navigating existing personnel practices. And did I say the state of Maine, private and private industry? So it has been a blast to work with this group. There's been lots of homework, but I've met a lot of great people. Last week, the current board of directors reached out and asked if I would be willing to serve on their board of directors. Given the priority of what I do currently, I think it's a good fit. However, I can't just say yes, because Section 5G of my employment agreement states the town council recognizes that the manager may desire to serve in such a capacity as appropriate on various municipal and state boards, and further agrees that her service represents a benefit to the town. Accordingly, the manager will be allowed to do so with prior approval of the council, so long as said commitments do not interfere with the normal and expected completion of her regular responsibilities as manager. So I bring this to you, I think with the support of the council chair.
Indeed, you commented to me about it recently, and I think it's a great fit for our community, and I'm very supportive of it. Any question from the group?
Congratulations.
Yes, indeed.
Is there, what gives when, what's the time commitment? And obviously, you're still just one person. So do you just add hours, or do you where do you take away from in order to accomplish this? Good question like this.
So I've added hours when I read the books that get assigned, and when I do the homework that's been assigned, watch the movies. And ultimately, there are hours, quite frankly, Leo, that in order to keep up with the expectations of council, I need to put in on one side or the other. What this means is I think I'll add another meeting a month, which have been all via Zoom, and I wouldn't be able to do this if they suddenly go to in-person, except for maybe 1 or 2 meetings a year. I don't have the time to drive all over the state. But if they're going to stay in a hybrid or Zoom platform, then I don't really see it as a lot. That said, I will tell you that when I kind of laugh when I say normal and expected completion of my regular responsibilities, because my regular responsibilities are really falling right off the plate. And luckily right now I've got a Belle who helps me pick them up and keep them in a Mitch that keeps them going. But if this wasn't such a high priority for me and also for council, I don't know that it would be the right fit, but it is a real high priority.
Anything else? I think you have approval of council. I know you do.
Excellent.
Any other business tonight?
Can I just add, I know that I am sitting in this chair for Sophie, but just in addition to the demolition on Ayers Island, they're needing to add another day because it was well built and the first explosion didn't take care of the deed. So they need to do another one tomorrow to take care of the rest of that, but that's exciting, and they're moving towards compliance with some of the challenges we had with that building. So it's exciting that they're moving in that direction.
Wow. Awesome. Before we adjourn tonight, I hope everybody saw Jeff's memo.
And I did have an email from a counselor who's not here tonight, who said she will be able
Great.
to do that responsibility for me. That's, thank you, Councilor Robinson.
All right,
I did not
all-
see I did not see Jeff's email. I'm sorry.
that's okay. You didn't need to.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Anything else? for us
Sophie, you
tonight?
actually did, because you made sure that we were in line for it.
All right, sorry.
Motion to adjourn. Second. All in favor? Yay. See everybody a week from tonight.
Have a good night.